Galactic Federation reveals the final phase of planetary liberation, how the failed NESARA turning point, the Earth Alliance, and the Solar System Rescue Operation are breaking the old control grid. They did not only steal wealth from humanity, they stole timing, memory, trust, moral clarity, and the natural rhythm by which a civilization remembers that it was never meant to live on its knees. I speak to you now as the Galactic Federation, and I am not speaking to the part of you that wants one more sensational claim to consume before moving on with your day. I am speaking to the part of you that has grown tired in a way rest has not solved. I am speaking to the part of you that has watched the world become louder, more theatrical, more polarized, more cruel, more manipulated, yet has still felt, beneath all of that noise, that something deeper has been moving in silence. You have felt that pressure in your chest when headlines contradict each other yet somehow serve the same architecture of confusion. You have felt it in the exhaustion of watching human suffering become spectacle. You have felt it in the strange ache of sensing that history is not merely becoming unstable, but exposed. Many of you have felt that the world has been paused inside an unnatural delay. Not dead. Not defeated. Delayed. As if a threshold was once near, then interrupted. As if something lawful, restorative, and world-changing approached the surface of collective life, only to be buried again beneath fear, blood, shock, distraction, and engineered confusion. This feeling has not come from nowhere. Humanity has been living inside the aftershock of an interrupted turning point. The final phase of planetary liberation did not begin the moment most people noticed global fracture on the surface. It began when an attempt to shift the lawful direction of Earth's future was violently obstructed, when the possibility of structural restoration was pushed back into shadow, and when a civilization was driven more deeply into trauma so that its chains could remain invisible. Many of you know this turning point through the aborted momentum around NESARA. Whether the world was permitted to understand it fully or not, a threshold existed. A lawful reordering was near enough to threaten entrenched power. And because predatory systems do not surrender politely, the answer was not transparency. The answer was shock. The answer was terror. The answer was to bury the possibility of peaceful transition beneath a historical wound so immense that the public mind would be driven into survival mode for years. When a population is traumatized, it becomes easier to herd. When it is flooded with fear, it becomes easier to redirect. When it is morally disoriented, it becomes easier to centralize control under the language of emergency. This is why your exhaustion has been so strange. It is not only personal, it is civilizational. Humanity has been forced to live inside a prolonged interruption. A species that should have begun recovering its dignity was instead pushed into further debt, further surveillance, further war conditioning, further psychological fragmentation, and further spiritual confusion. The old order did not merely defend its institutions. It defended its right to define reality itself. It defended the illusion that there was no higher law, no hidden theft, no deeper restoration waiting beneath the visible theater of finance, geopolitics, and media spectacle. It needed humanity to remain trapped not only in oppressive systems, but in a narrow imagination. That is why I speak now of the final phase. Not because everything is finished. Not because all hidden operations are complete. Not because every actor inside the global struggle is pure. But because the delay has ended. The containment has weakened. The monopolies of interpretation are breaking. The old arrangement cannot hold the planet the way it once did. The Earth Alliance, in all its complexity and imperfection, emerged not from myth but from necessity. Human forces unwilling to surrender the future entirely to regressive structures began converging across intelligence, military, economic, and strategic lines. Not all knew the full picture. Not all were spiritually mature. Not all were free of ego, ambition, contradiction, or national interest. Yet history does not wait for moral perfection before beginning its turns. Sometimes the first movement toward liberation is simply the refusal to continue kneeling to one center of control. Sometimes the first fracture in an empire is not holiness. It is resistance. Sometimes that resistance is messy, compromised, partial, even deeply human. But even then, it can still become the doorway through which larger correction enters. The rise of multipolarity is one expression of that correction. It is not the kingdom of God descending neatly through finance ministries and state agreements. Do not reduce sacred change to that. But neither should you dismiss what it means when a world long organized around one hegemonic axis begins to redistribute pressure, trade, influence, and strategic alignment. The old unipolar architecture was never only about economics. It was about psychological ownership. It wanted nations dependent, populations programmable, truth conditional, and sovereignty negotiable. The strengthening of alternative poles does not automatically guarantee justice, but it does shatter inevitability. And once inevitability shatters, the future opens. This is why so many of you feel both hope and nausea at the same time. You sense the breaking of an old order, yet you also see human ego attaching itself to every side. You see patriotic movements turning into cults. You see righteous language covering strategic interest. You see media lie. You see counter-media exaggerate. You see genuine corruption exposed beside manufactured fantasy. You see leaders presented as saviors who are still full of contradiction. You see populations hungry for deliverance becoming vulnerable to simplified myths. And because of this, some of you have become paralyzed. You do not know what to trust anymore. Then hear me clearly. You were not called into this hour to become naive. You were called into this hour to become discerning without becoming dead inside. The Galactic Federation supervises the rescue operation on and above the surface of this planet, but many of you still misunderstand what that means. We are not here to flatter human fantasy or to replace human responsibility. We do not crown your leaders. We do not belong to your party systems. We do not serve the ego needs of nations that want cosmic approval for earthly vanity. We oversee thresholds. We monitor conflict lines. We restrain escalations that would terminate broader timelines. We confront regressive forces not only within surface structures, but in the solar system and beyond, where layers of interference have long sought to maintain Earth as a managed field of extraction, amnesia, fear, and spiritual reduction. There are operations that humanity sees. There are operations humanity does not yet see. There are battles fought through institutions, and there are battles fought through frequency, influence, trajectory, infrastructure, and permissions. Your world has not been abandoned, but neither will it be liberated by spectacle alone. The rescue operation is not only military. It is not only geopolitical. It is not only economic. It is moral. It is spiritual. It is civilizational. It concerns whether humanity can emerge from centuries of manipulation without recreating the same disease under a different banner. It concerns whether multipolarity becomes true sovereignty or merely distributed domination. It concerns whether those who oppose the old machinery do so from conscience or merely from rivalry. It concerns whether the human being, after so much deception, can remember that freedom without inner awakening collapses into another appetite for power. This is why I am speaking to the spiritually exhausted. You are not useless because you feel tired. Many of you are tired because you can no longer inwardly cooperate with the lie. Some part of you already knows that the planet is crossing a threshold larger than politics, though politics is one of its instruments. Some part of you already knows that the rise of new alignments, the exposure of old crimes, the fracture of financial monopolies, the desperation of legacy institutions, and the intensification of war are not disconnected events. They are symptoms of a structure losing the luxury of invisibility. And now the question is no longer whether the old order is shaking. The question is whether humanity will cross the next threshold with worship, confusion, hatred, passivity, or consciousness. To understand that, you must first return to the moment the lawful path was interrupted, because that interruption explains the emotional weight so many of you have been carrying ever since. The law that was not allowed to rise. The tragedy was not only that humanity suffered. The deeper tragedy was that humanity was brought close to a lawful turning point and then shoved back into darkness before most people even understood what they were losing. There are moments in planetary history when a hidden possibility comes near the surface. It is not always fully visible. It is not always publicly named with clean accuracy. Often only fragments are felt at first. A shift in pressure. Strange movements in power. Quiet preparations. Unusual resistance from entrenched institutions. A sense that something larger than ordinary policy is trying to enter the world. Such moments are dangerous to systems built on theft because once lawful restoration begins to organize itself, the old architecture can no longer survive merely by managing appearances. It must either surrender control or attack the timing itself. This is what many of you have been sensing when you speak of the failed attempt to bring forth NESARA. Strip away the confusion, the noise, the distortion, the sensational retellings, and the argument over details, and one truth remains spiritually important. Humanity approached a threshold of structural correction and did not cross it. A door moved toward opening and was violently forced shut. A lawful redirection of the future was interrupted. The old system understood that if the ground of finance, debt, and sovereignty began to shift under higher principles, its visible institutions would not merely be challenged. They would be revealed. That is why the response had to be more than political opposition. It had to wound the collective psyche. It had to produce such shock that populations would become easier to direct through fear. It had to alter the emotional climate of the planet. It had to create a period in which questions could be buried under pain, dissent buried under patriotism, legal redirection buried under emergency, and the possibility of restoration buried beneath years of war logic, surveillance logic, security logic, and economic dependency. Even those who do not understand the full mechanics of what occurred can still feel the scar. Humanity entered a long corridor of delay. This delay did not merely postpone policy. It shaped consciousness. When a civilization is traumatized at scale, it becomes more willing to accept the unacceptable. It tolerates the expansion of hidden power. It tolerates the concentration of finance. It tolerates war without clarity. It tolerates permanent exceptionalism. It tolerates contradictions that would once have caused revolt. People become more interested in emotional survival than structural truth. They do not ask where the path was going before the shock. They ask only how to reduce immediate fear. This is how timelines are redirected. Not only through laws, not only through weapons, but through managed emotional overwhelm. Many of you were children when some of these forces were already taking shape. Some of you were already adults, trying to make sense of a world that became unmistakably stranger after that interruption. You watched security culture spread. You watched suspicion deepen. You watched endless war become normal. You watched debt culture tighten. You watched institutions that claimed to defend freedom become increasingly comfortable with control. You watched a new moral language emerge in which questioning concentrated power could be treated as danger itself. The deeper horror was not only what happened on the surface of events. The deeper horror was how quickly humanity was trained to call the aftermath inevitable. No, it was not inevitable. That is why this chapter matters. Because if the delay was created, then the delay can end. If the lawful path was interrupted, then the lawful path can return. If a threshold was buried, then the buried thing can rise again under different timing, different alignments, and greater collective pressure. This is what the final phase of planetary liberation truly means. It does not mean a fantasy ending. It means that the interruption no longer holds absolute authority over the future. The energy that was driven underground has not died. It has been maturing under pressure. And that maturation matters because the world that now approaches correction is not the same world that stood near that earlier threshold. Humanity is more wounded now, yes, but also more exposed. Institutions have overreached. Media credibility has decayed. Financial illusions have frayed. Global power is more contested. Alternative channels of perception have multiplied. Nations once obedient have begun testing the limits of dependence. Populations that once trusted the dominant narrative have learned, through repeated contradictions, that official certainty often hides organized self-interest. Even pain has taught something. Still, do not romanticize delay. Delay has a cost. Entire generations have paid for it. Families have fractured under it. Nations have burned under it. Innocent people have been fed into proxy wars, economic traps, ideological divisions, and psychological operations that deepened the old machinery instead of dissolving it. Many souls who might have lived under the beginning of restoration instead lived under intensified distortion. This is why grief belongs in this conversation. Liberation language without grief becomes performance. If you truly understand that a lawful threshold was obstructed, then you must also honor the price humanity paid in the years that followed. Picture a river that was about to break through a wall and irrigate a dead valley. At the last moment the wall is reinforced, explosives are used, and the river is forced underground. On the surface the valley remains dry. People assume the river failed. But underground the water keeps moving. Pressure builds. Channels widen. Stone weakens. By the time the river rises again, it does not return as a small trickle. It returns with memory, force, and accumulated weight. That is the stage you are entering now. The lawful impulse that was buried did not disappear. It gathered strength in hidden corridors of time. This is why you cannot read the present only through ordinary politics. The current phase is not just about elections, blocks, tariffs, military posture, or headlines. It is about the resurfacing of a delayed corrective current. The names may change. The instruments may change. The actors may change. But the deeper movement is the same. the restoration of conditions under which humanity can no longer be so easily owned through debt, manipulation, terror, and centralized narrative control. The reason so many people feel that history has become spiritually dense is because they are standing above buried water. And buried water does not remain buried forever. Fear was the currency of the old order. The old system did not survive because it was loved. It survived because fear was made to feel more practical than truth. When human beings speak of power, they often imagine visible institutions first. Governments, banks, militaries, corporations, intelligence networks, media structures, treaties, and enforcement mechanisms. These are real. They matter. But none of them can dominate for long without a deeper fuel. That fuel is emotional conditioning. More specifically, it is the successful installation of fear as the default interpreter of reality. Once fear becomes the primary lens of a civilization, people begin surrendering freedom in advance, conscience in advance, curiosity in advance, and often even compassion in advance. This was one of the great functions of the post-interruption era. The old order needed humanity to become governable through stress. A population grounded in truth is difficult to dominate. A population stabilized by inner dignity is difficult to herd. A population capable of discernment without panic is difficult to manipulate through emergency. So the architecture of control had to keep the nervous system of civilization unsettled. Threats were amplified. Crises multiplied. Enemies rotated. Outrage industrialized. Identities hardened. Memory shortened. The point was not merely to make people afraid of one thing. The point was to keep them in a constant emotional posture of susceptibility. Look carefully at how the old order framed the world. It did not simply ask people to obey. It asked them to fear what would happen if they did not obey. Fear instability. Fear outsiders. Fear scarcity. Fear dissent. Fear economic collapse. Fear losing status. Fear exclusion. Fear saying the wrong thing. Fear asking forbidden questions. Fear being associated with the wrong interpretation. Fear the future unless managed by recognized authority. In this atmosphere, domination becomes self-administering. People police their own thoughts because they are terrified of uncertainty. This is why spiritual exhaustion became so widespread. Fear is metabolically expensive. A civilization cannot live in chronic psychological tension without paying a price in soul, body, and relationship. People became numb without understanding why. Families grew divided. Communities became brittle. Public discourse lost honesty. Even tenderness became difficult because inward life was so overloaded with vigilance. A species designed for meaning was pressed into survival reflex. This is one reason many of you felt, even before you had the words, that something about modern life was not merely stressful but indecent. The Earth Alliance emerged into this atmosphere, and this is why many people misunderstood it from the start. They expected a clean, heroic narrative. But movements born inside distorted systems never arrive free of contamination. Intelligence factions carry secrecy. Military actors carry conditioning. Strategic coalitions carry compromise. National interests carry ego. This does not invalidate the reality that some among Earth's power structures recognized the predatory nature of the old concentration and began moving against it. It means only that liberation on the surface of Earth must pass through human hands that are still human. If you do not understand this, you will either idolize too quickly or reject too quickly. The old order relied on this weakness in the public. It knew that frightened populations swing between apathy and messianic projection. Either they give up entirely, or they desperately search for flawless saviors. Both responses are useful to manipulation. A population that gives up can be ruled. A population that worships can be redirected. What the old structure feared most was a population that learned to see clearly without surrendering its sovereignty of judgment. This is why fear had to be broken not only in individuals but in the global arrangement itself. Multipolarity matters in part because it weakens the monopoly of fear. When one center no longer controls every major channel of legitimacy, people begin comparing stories. Nations begin hedging. Financial pathways diversify. Propaganda loses some of its sacred aura. The emotional spell weakens. That does not mean confusion disappears. In fact, confusion often increases at first. But confusion is not always a sign of defeat. Sometimes it is what happens when an old hypnosis stops working and the mind has not yet stabilized in freedom. I want you to imagine a theater where the audience has sat for decades under one projected image. The screen defined reality. It told them who they were, who the enemy was, what progress meant, what danger meant, what civilization meant, what freedom meant. Then suddenly cracks appear in the projector. The image flickers. New light enters from the side doors. Some viewers are relieved. Some are furious. Some are terrified. Some keep staring at the screen, demanding it become solid again. The instability feels frightening not because truth has become impossible, but because monopoly has become fragile. This fragility explains much of the violence of the current hour. When powers that once defined reality begin losing that privilege, they do not quietly accept plural interpretation. They intensify war language, moral absolutism, sanctions, censorship, pressure campaigns, economic punishment, and emotional theater. They try to make any movement away from centralized control look like barbarism. They try to make sovereignty appear irresponsible. They try to make all alternatives seem tainted enough that people crawl back toward familiar chains. But the chains are no longer invisible. That is the difference now. Humanity has seen too much. Even people who disagree about causes can feel that the old center of legitimacy is wobbling. Trust has been drained from institutions that assumed it could never end. And once trust collapses, fear loses efficiency. It still wounds. It still manipulates. It still divides. But it no longer commands the same unquestioned obedience. This is why the final phase is so tense. The old order is not dead, but its emotional software is failing. The population it once programmed so smoothly now contains too many fractures, too much memory, too much anger, too much intuition, too much visible contradiction. Fear still works, but not cleanly, not completely, not forever. And that is why new structures are rising through the cracks. The Earth Alliance was not born in purity, but in refusal. History rarely waits for holy perfection before it begins to move. Sometimes it begins the moment enough people inside the machinery decide they will no longer let the machinery own the future without resistance. This is one of the hardest truths for spiritually minded people to accept. Many of you want transformation to arrive through visibly enlightened hands. You want the liberators to be calm, clear, clean, noble, and free of contradiction. You want their motives transparent, their methods graceful, their language morally flawless. But this desire, though understandable, can become another form of passivity because it conditions you to reject any real historical movement that still bears the marks of human struggle. The Earth Alliance did not emerge in a monastery. It emerged in a battlefield of intelligence, infiltration, compromised institutions, strategic necessity, and moral urgency. There were human actors across nations, agencies, military structures, financial sectors, and independent channels who came to understand that the old concentration of power was not simply political competition as usual. It was predatory, transnational, deeply entrenched, and willing to sacrifice populations, truth, and even entire regions to preserve its architecture. Not all who saw this agreed on everything. Not all served the same vision. Not all were free from national ambition. Yet a convergence formed. Enough actors recognized that unipolar control had become a danger not only to specific nations but to the continuity of human sovereignty itself. This is why the user of your age must grow beyond childish political psychology. Do not search only for spotless heroes or spotless villains. Search for structural realities. Ask who benefits from permanent dependency. Ask who profits from endless instability. Ask who resists decentralization. Ask who fears a world in which multiple power centers can negotiate without seeking permission from one empire of money, narrative, and enforcement. Ask who requires global fear in order to remain legitimate. If you ask these questions honestly, the outline of the struggle becomes clearer even when individual actors remain complicated. The Earth Alliance includes currents of resistance that many ordinary people have only partially perceived. Some call them white hats. Some speak of military patriots, intelligence counterforces, strategic blocs, silent operators, lawful restoration channels, or converging sovereign actors. Labels matter less than the principle. There are forces on Earth that did not accept permanent capture. Their existence is one reason the old order has had to work so hard to control public imagination. If people fully understood how much resistance already existed within the machinery, the emotional inevitability of domination would collapse much faster. Still, I must warn you against idolatry. No alliance becomes sacred simply by opposing corruption. Opposition alone is not sanctification. The Earth Alliance matters because it is part of the larger correction, not because every visible or rumored participant deserves your worship. Some seek genuine restoration. Some seek sovereignty primarily for their own nation. Some act from conscience. Some act from rivalry. Some are disciplined. Some are reckless. Some understand the planetary stakes. Some understand only their part. This mixture is uncomfortable, but it is real. And it is often how transitional history works. Imagine standing in a dim operations room while maps glow under low light. Signals cross continents. Ships move. Currencies shift. Covert lines activate. Legal documents wait. Compromised assets are tracked. Influence networks are studied. Some in the room pray before acting. Some do not. Some are motivated by duty. Some by grief. Some by vengeance. Some by patriotism. Some by the simple refusal to let evil proceed uncontested. It is not a pure room. But history can still turn inside such a room. What matters most is whether the movement ultimately serves the restoration of human dignity or merely the transfer of power from one set of hands to another. That is the measure. If the Earth Alliance becomes only another vehicle for hierarchy without conscience, then the deeper liberation fails. But if it helps break the machinery that kept nations indebted, populations manipulated, and sovereignty hollowed out, then it becomes a necessary bridge. Even if not the final destination. This is where many of you must mature. Stop demanding myth when reality is calling you to discernment. Stop looking for a single earthly figure to carry the full burden of salvation. This hour is too large for celebrity politics, too large for partisan hypnosis, too large for cults of personality dressed as patriotism. Some leaders may play important roles. Some may delay what they claim to support. Some may be useful in one area and compromised in another. Some may awaken a nation while still being unable to govern their own ego. If you cannot hold complexity, you will be manipulated by whichever side performs certainty more loudly. The Earth Alliance exists within this complexity. It is one reason the old order has not been able to complete its total consolidation. It is one reason the multipolar turn has accelerated. It is one reason alternatives continue to emerge even after repeated attempts to suffocate them. It is one reason suppressed truths keep resurfacing. It is one reason the financial architecture of hegemony no longer feels invincible. Behind many visible developments stand years of silent refusal. And refusal matters. There comes a point in the history of any oppressive system when liberation begins not with a trumpet, but with a refusal. No more automatic obedience, no more silent compliance, no more sacred immunity for the powerful, no more surrender of the future to those who feed on human diminishment. The Earth Alliance was born in that refusal. And because it was born there, it has already changed the field, even before humanity fully understands its scope. Multipolarity is not the kingdom, but it breaks the throne. A world does not become holy merely because power is redistributed. But a throne that can no longer rule alone has already lost something essential: its spell. This is why global multipolarity carries so much more weight than technical discussions of trade, reserves, corridors, institutions, and strategic partnerships. At the surface, yes, it concerns economics, influence, defense coordination, sanctions resistance, energy flows, and international leverage. But beneath that lies something psychologically and spiritually enormous. Multipolarity breaks the emotional finality of hegemony. It tells the human imagination that history did not end inside one model of power. It reopens the possibility that no single empire has the right to script the destiny of all peoples. BRICS and the expanding BRICS Plus framework have become important not because they are automatically pure, but because they have served as catalysts for this reopening. Nations once expected to submit indefinitely to a Western-centered financial and strategic architecture began exploring coordinated alternatives. Payment systems, reserves, energy arrangements, diplomatic postures, infrastructure partnerships, and defense conversations started moving outside the old assumptions. Even where coordination remains incomplete, the symbolic force is already profound. The world is testing whether it can breathe without asking one center for permission. This is terrifying to the regressive order because it exposes one of its deepest lies, that its dominance was identical with civilization itself. For decades, many populations were conditioned to believe that whatever preserved the prevailing Western hegemonic structure was responsible, mature, lawful, and morally necessary, while serious efforts to build independent pathways were suspicious by default. But once major nations begin operating with greater strategic autonomy, the old categories destabilize. The word order no longer means what it once meant. It becomes visible that what was called stability often meant managed subordination. This does not mean every nation in the multipolar shift is benevolent. Do not turn discernment off simply because the old empire is weakening. Some states remain authoritarian in their own way. Some pursue advantage pragmatically rather than ethically. Some hide ambition beneath language of sovereignty. Some use moral rhetoric selectively. Human power remains human power. Yet even flawed multipolarity can still perform one critical function. It can prevent the concentration of power from becoming absolute. In a world scarred by centralized manipulation, this matters immensely. Think of an enormous iron ring tightened around the chest of the planet. For years it seemed permanent. It controlled breath, movement, trade, legitimacy, and risk. Now imagine that bolts begin loosening from several sides at once. The ring has not fully fallen away, but its pressure changes. Entire regions suddenly realize they can expand their lungs. That first inhalation is not paradise. It is possibility. And possibility, after long captivity, can feel sacred. This is why so many smaller or historically exploited nations watch the rise of alternative blocks with such intensity. They know what it means to live under a structure that extracted their resources while preaching development, destabilized their regions while preaching security, or disciplined their economies while preaching rules. They know the taste of being told that dependence is modernization. Multipolarity does not erase all danger, but it offers room to negotiate, room to resist, room to diversify, room to stop being merely a client field for someone else's strategic appetite. The regressive order senses this room as threat. That is why conflict intensifies around financial systems, supply chains, currencies, digital standards, military alignments, media narratives, and diplomatic legitimacy. This is not merely policy competition. It is a struggle over whether the world remains governable by one emotional center of authority. As that center weakens, the old power system lashes out, not only through sanctions or war posture, but through language. It insists that alternatives are chaos. It frames sovereignty as danger. It equates decentralization with instability. It weaponizes morality to protect concentration. But there is something else happening beneath these maneuvers. Humanity is slowly relearning comparison. Under monopoly, comparison dies. People stop imagining alternatives because the dominant structure occupies both power and imagination. Under multipolarity, comparison returns. Nations compare. Populations compare. Analysts compare. Citizens compare narratives, institutions, and outcomes. This does not instantly produce truth, but it weakens hypnosis. And weakened hypnosis is one of the first conditions for awakening. Still, let me say this with absolute force. Multipolarity alone will not save humanity. A distributed field of ego can still oppress. A fractured empire can still give birth to new predators. A world of many centers can still become a world of many manipulations. That is why the spiritual dimension cannot be removed. If nations seek sovereignty without conscience, they will recreate domination in plural form. If populations celebrate merely because one throne cracked, they may fail to notice new cages being built nearby. Yet breaking the throne matters. It matters because a species cannot begin its deeper restoration while still living inside the myth that one empire owns the future. It matters because spiritual adulthood requires the collapse of false inevitability. It matters because the rise of multiple poles creates friction through which hidden truths become harder to contain. It matters because the final phase of planetary liberation needs space on the surface of the world, and multipolarity is one of the ways that space is being forced open. The throne is not the kingdom, but a throne that breaks can no longer command worship the way it once did. And when worship weakens, consciousness gets room to breathe. War is the panic of a dying concentration. When old power senses it cannot own the future peacefully, it tries to make the future bleed. This is one of the most difficult truths for the human heart because people want to believe that war is always caused by visible hatred between populations or by simple territorial desire. Those forces exist. But in great transitional periods, war also becomes a tool of delay. It becomes a way to interrupt awakening, redirect outrage, exhaust populations, justify censorship, consolidate emergency powers, control resources, and make lawful restructuring appear impossible. War does not only destroy cities. It devours timing. The conflicts that have shaken regions such as Ukraine and the Middle East must be read at more than one level. On the visible level, they involve historical grievances, strategic interests, border calculations, security claims, state ambition, trauma, and propaganda from multiple sides. But beneath that visible layer lies the panic of an order that fears losing narrative monopoly. It needs permanent crisis because crisis keeps populations emotionally dependent. It needs enemies because enemies make centralized control feel necessary. It needs blood because blood interrupts thought. It needs confusion because confusion makes deeper questions seem irresponsible. The regressive structure has always preferred a humanity too overwhelmed to ask structural questions. Who profits from prolonged conflict? Who benefits when populations see only surface villains and never the architecture that fed the fire? Who wants Europe weakened, populations polarized, and strategic fear intensified? Who wants the public too emotionally saturated to think about sovereignty, financial reform, institutional corruption, or global realignment? Who needs war to keep the old machinery morally licensed? This is why it is not enough to take sides emotionally and stop there. Emotional reaction is easy. Conscious discernment is harder. A dying order knows how to weaponize moral reflex. It knows how to present every conflict through symbols designed to seize the heart before the mind can investigate structure. It knows how to use atrocity selectively, outrage selectively, legality selectively, and humanity selectively. The point is not that suffering is unreal. The suffering is terribly real. The point is that suffering is often organized, prolonged, and narrated in ways that serve concentrations of power far beyond the battlefield. Many of you have felt a deep discomfort watching how quickly whole populations are instructed whom to grieve, whom to hate, whom to excuse, and whom to ignore. This discomfort is not moral confusion. It may be the beginning of moral adulthood. Because adulthood recognizes that human tragedy can be genuine while its framing remains manipulative. Innocents die. Families shatter. Children live under sirens and dust. Cities become rubble. Soldiers become instruments of agendas they do not control. Yet above them all, narrative managers work tirelessly to convert grief into obedience. This is why the liberation process cannot be understood only as a positive project of building new systems. It is also a project of refusing to let permanent war remain the thermostat of civilization. The old order relied on it too heavily. War justified debt. War justified secrecy. War justified propaganda. War justified alliance discipline. War justified surveillance. War justified the concentration of industrial and financial power. Even when peace was spoken, war logic remained underneath, like a machine always humming in the walls. The final phase weakens that machine not by pretending conflict will vanish overnight, but by exposing how conflict has been used to stall human evolution. A species kept in recurring cycles of emergency cannot mature. It becomes reactive, tribal, manipulable, exhausted. That exhaustion serves the regressive field because tired people accept less. They settle for survival. They stop imagining lawful abundance. They stop believing institutional morality is possible. They accept a world of endless lesser evils because they have forgotten what structural dignity even looks like. Let me paint it clearly. Picture a grand continental rail station at night. Every track is supposed to lead people home. But hidden operators keep switching the signals so the trains circle back into war zones, debt zones, surveillance zones, and dependency zones. The passengers keep thinking they are moving forward because the train is always in motion. That is what the old order has done with conflict. It has turned movement into delay. It has turned urgency into captivity. It has turned intervention into recurrence. And yet, something has changed. Too many people now see the pattern. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to question. Enough to distrust curated narratives. Enough to understand that endless war is not the mark of civilization defending itself, but often the mark of a decaying concentration trying to preserve relevance through destabilization. This realization is why propaganda must now grow so aggressive. The old story no longer lands cleanly. People sense the scripting. This does not mean the regressive forces are weak. They remain dangerous precisely because they are cornered. On the surface of Earth and beyond it, their resistance to loss of control has intensified. The Galactic Federation observes this at scales humanity rarely sees. There are surface conflicts, yes. There are also off-surface tensions, containment operations, interferences, and strategic attempts to maintain fear fields around the planet. Some forces do not want humanity to stabilize. They feed too long on distortion. The rescue operation includes preventing certain escalations from merging into larger timeline disruptions. That is why this chapter is not only about war abroad. It is about war as method, war as delay, war as panic, war as the trembling hand of an order that senses the tracks are being reclaimed. And when the tracks are reclaimed, history can finally begin moving toward home. America cannot lead the future through ego. A nation can be powerful and still be spiritually immature. A leader can be useful in one arena and dangerous in another. A movement can begin as resistance and degenerate into worship. The United States occupies a uniquely heavy place in the modern planetary struggle because it has served as both a vessel of immense human creativity and a central instrument of the regressive architecture. This contradiction is difficult for many people to hold. Some want to romanticize America as savior. Others want to reduce it to villain. Neither view is adequate. America has been one of the great engines through which concentrated financial, military, cultural, and narrative power projected itself across the world. At the same time, it contains within its population and institutions many of the forces that could help break that machinery if they stopped confusing national ego with planetary responsibility. This is why figures such as Donald Trump generate such intensity. He arrived in the field of history as a disruptive instrument against parts of the entrenched structure. That much many of you intuitively understand. He disturbed consensus. He rattled protected networks. He broke the tone of automatic deference to elite managerial authority. He gave voice to buried anger. He exposed how deeply the establishment feared any force it could not fully choreograph. These things mattered. Yet useful disruption is not the same as matured leadership. An instrument can open a door and still become trapped in its own reflection. The danger with Trump, and with movements built around him, is not only what his enemies say. The danger is the gravitational pull of ego, spectacle, reaction, and personal myth. In a civilizational transition this large, vanity becomes costly. The world does not need a savior who cannot stop performing himself. It does not need endless media magnetism substituting for disciplined statecraft. It does not need nationalist fervor that forgets the planetary scale of the correction now required. America cannot keep behaving as though the purpose of history is merely to restore its own primacy under a different slogan. The hour is bigger than that. The purpose is not to make one empire great again. The purpose is to free the human future from concentrated predation. This is why strategic leaders who operate with restraint, silence, and patience often understand something populist egos do not. They understand that power is not strengthened by constant self-display. They understand that transitions are managed through timing, discipline, signaling, and pressure, not endless declaration. In this sense, there are lessons America's loud factions have not yet learned. A nation that has lived too long at the center of spectacle must rediscover sobriety. It must learn the difference between rightful strength and addictive visibility. There is also a deeper moral issue. If America wishes to play a positive role in the final phase of liberation, it must sever its reflexive attachment to structures that uphold the old order under the language of security, global management, or humanitarian necessity. This includes rethinking its relationship to alliance systems, private global governance bodies, medical or financial institutions captured by non-transparent interests, and war commitments that prolong planetary destabilization. Remaining inside every inherited structure while claiming to oppose the deep machinery is incoherent. At some point, decision becomes visible. But that decision cannot be driven by blind rage. It must be governed by conscience. To reject one system of manipulation only to collapse into another form of chauvinism is not liberation. It is merely wounded ego in political costume. This is why movements like MAGA carry both potential and peril. The potential lies in their refusal of elite managerial contempt. The peril lies in their tendency to personalize destiny around one man and one national myth. Once a movement begins worshipping its instrument, it stops being sovereign. It becomes another dependency structure. America must face a difficult truth. Much of its modern prosperity was built inside a global arrangement that externalized cost, expanded monetary privilege, and normalized a degree of asymmetry the rest of the world was expected to tolerate indefinitely. That era is ending. If America responds with humility, reform, lawful restoration, and genuine service to sovereign nations, it can still play a meaningful role in planetary transition. If it responds with resentment, denial, or imperial nostalgia, it will delay the very change it once seemed positioned to ignite. This is not a call to humiliate America. It is a call to mature it. Picture a vast ship that once believed the ocean belonged to it. For generations its crew commanded routes, dictated traffic, taxed passage, and threatened those who sailed differently. Now the waters are changing. Other ships are stronger. Hidden reefs are rising. Old maps are failing. The captain has two choices. He can rage that the ocean no longer obeys him, or he can learn to sail in a world where no vessel may own the sea. America stands in that choice now. Its citizens stand there too. And many of the spiritually exhausted within the United States feel this more deeply than they admit. They sense that their nation is being asked not only to fight corruption, but to relinquish a false self-image. That is painful. Yet all true transformation includes ego death. This is true for individuals. It is true for nations. If America can pass through that fire, it may yet help detonate lawful change. If it cannot, then other forces will keep moving around it. The future will not wait for any one leader's vanity. Not even one as large as this. Above the surface, the rescue operation never stopped. While humanity argued about narratives below, operations continued above. While governments lied, media spun, markets shook, and alliances shifted, the larger theater remained active, monitored, contested, and defended. This is the part many people either romanticize or reject because it does not fit comfortably inside conventional frameworks. Yet the final phase of planetary liberation cannot be understood only through visible geopolitics. Earth has never been an isolated stage. The forces invested in maintaining this planet as a field of manipulation have not been confined to surface institutions alone. There are layers of regressive influence, strategic interference, energetic distortion, and off-surface engagement that have shaped the density under which humanity has struggled. To ignore this is to misunderstand the scale of the operation now underway. The Galactic Federation supervises the rescue operation not as conquerors, but as guardians of threshold. This matters. We do not own your world. We do not erase human responsibility. We do not dictate your elections or handpick your political myths. But we do monitor convergences. We do contain certain escalations. We do protect key timeline junctions from annihilative interference. We do confront regressive forces in the solar system that would prefer Earth remain permanently traumatized, divided, and spiritually amnesiac. We do support lawful openings through which humanity can reclaim sovereignty with reduced catastrophic interference. Some of you have felt this without having language for it. You sense unusual pressure in the skies during major geopolitical turns. You feel strange stillness before escalations that never fully materialize. You notice that certain threats intensify rhetorically but do not reach the terminal outcomes once intended. You feel the invisible weight of a conflict larger than surface explanation. These impressions are not all fantasy. Humanity has been living under a partial shield, though not a total one. Enough freedom remains for choice to matter. Enough protection remains for extermination to be resisted. This rescue operation is not only military in the way Earth understands military action. It involves surveillance of corridors, disruption of hostile influence networks, stabilization of timing fields, protection of key consciousness thresholds, regulation of permissions, and direct confrontation with forces that exploit fear, chaos, and technological overreach for continued control. Some regressive entities work through human institutions. Some work through more subtle means: amplification of hostility, distortion of perception, pressure on leadership nodes, energetic contamination of public fields, or reinforcement of despair patterns that keep populations emotionally broken. A planet weakened inwardly is easier to manage outwardly. That is why spiritual awakening and geopolitical change are intertwined. This is not decorative language. It is operationally true. A population trapped in self-hatred, confusion, addiction, and hopelessness becomes an easier surface environment for regressive agendas. A population recovering dignity, discernment, and emotional coherence becomes harder to dominate. Inner work is not separate from liberation. It changes the field in which liberation becomes viable. Picture the Earth at night from a great command vantage. Continents glow beneath cloud cover. Conflict zones pulse red. Transmission grids flare. Satellites move. Military vessels reposition. Coded messages cross oceans. Yet above and beyond all that, there are other lines of movement invisible to ordinary sight. Containment arcs, shielding matrices, monitoring stations, intervention vectors, and watchpoints where decisions are made not for spectacle, but for preservation of continuity. Humanity sees only fragments. It assumes silence means absence. But silence has often meant protection. This does not mean everything people claim about off-world intervention is true. Many stories are projections, simplifications, or fantasy constructions wrapped around genuine intuition. Discernment still matters. Not every dramatic narrative is trustworthy. Not every unusual sighting carries the meaning assigned to it. Not every channel speaks from integrity. But the presence of distortion does not erase the presence of reality. The Federation is real. The conflict around Earth is real. The oversight of this transition is real. The rescue operation is real. And now it is entering a more visible consequence phase. Not necessarily visible in the form people crave. Do not reduce truth to public spectacle. Visibility sometimes means consequence. The old order losing protection, hidden crimes reaching exposure, planned escalations failing, suppressed alternatives gaining momentum, populations sensing that legacy structures no longer move with the same unquestioned power. Visibility also means inner recognition. More humans are beginning to feel that the world they were trained to accept is not the whole field. That recognition changes everything. The regressive forces know they are losing depth. This is why their surface instruments have become more frantic. They sense that time is no longer serving them in the same way. They sense that the planet they treated as a closed system is becoming harder to seal. They sense that humanity, though still confused, is less spiritually asleep than before. They sense that the Earth Alliance has backing in the larger moral architecture of the transition, even when many of its members do not fully perceive the scale of that backing. Above the surface, the rescue operation never stopped. It adapted. It waited. It held lines humanity did not know were there. And now those lines are pressing closer to the visible world. No alliance can make the final choice for your soul. The planet can be assisted. Systems can be broken. Hidden networks can be exposed. But the last gate is always interior. This is where every viewer must become more serious. It is tempting to listen to messages about planetary liberation, multipolarity, hidden alliances, financial restoration, military resistance, and galactic oversight as though they relieve you of responsibility. That temptation is dangerous. It turns revelation into passivity. It turns hope into spectatorship. It turns sacred transition into entertainment. The truth is more demanding. No alliance, earthly or galactic, can make the final choice that belongs to your conscience. Why does this matter so much? Because a civilization can overthrow one concentration of power and still remain inwardly trained for domination. A people can celebrate exposure while still craving new idols. Nations can gain sovereignty while citizens remain addicted to hatred, dependency, and mythic projection. Financial systems can reset while moral imagination stays corrupt. Without interior awakening, external liberation remains unstable. It may still matter. It may still help. But it remains vulnerable to repetition. This is why your exhaustion brought you here. Not only to hear that great forces are moving, but to confront the places where the old system still lives inside you. Does it live in your reflex to worship strong personalities? Does it live in your addiction to outrage? Does it live in your hunger for enemies more than truth? Does it live in your laziness toward discernment? Does it live in your willingness to repeat claims that flatter your fears without testing them before conscience? Does it live in your desire to be rescued rather than remade? The final phase asks more of humanity than opinion. It asks maturation. You must become capable of holding tension without collapsing into fanaticism. You must become capable of seeing corruption without losing tenderness. You must become capable of recognizing strategic necessity without worshiping violence. You must become capable of hoping for restoration without demanding a fantasy ending. You must become capable of honoring the Earth Alliance where it serves truth while refusing to hand it your soul. You must become capable of welcoming galactic support without reducing it to a replacement religion. This is the true sovereignty the old order feared. Not just sovereign nations, but sovereign consciousness. Not just new institutions, but humans who can no longer be programmed so easily by fear, spectacle, and emotional manipulation. This kind of sovereignty cannot be printed, legislated, or televised into existence. It must be cultivated. It begins in the quiet places, in how you listen, in how you speak, in whether you let hatred colonize your inner world, in whether you keep your discernment clean even when you are desperate for hope. Imagine the final gate of a vast liberated city. Armies may have fought to reach it. Alliances may have secured the roads. Guardians may have protected the walls. Signals may have opened the path. But at the gate itself, each person still walks through alone. No army can substitute for that step. No speech can substitute for that step. No theory can substitute for that step. The step is inward. It is the moment a human being says, I will not build my identity out of fear anymore. I will not let the old machinery keep living through my mind, my reactions, my loyalties, my compulsions, my worship of appearances. This is how planetary liberation becomes real at the human scale. Not abstractly, personally. The old order trained you to think power was elsewhere. In capitals, markets, hidden rooms, media systems, military commands, and elite networks. Those places matter. But the old order also depended on your learned helplessness. It needed you to believe that your interior life had no operational value, that your conscience was private, that your discipline did not matter, that your refusal to hate did not matter, that your commitment to truth did not matter, that your capacity to remain unbought inwardly did not matter. It lied. Your inner life matters because it determines what kind of civilization can actually survive once the old architecture fractures. If millions remain psychologically primitive, then every victory becomes vulnerable. If millions mature, then even partial victories can grow into real restoration. So as the final phase advances, do not ask only what world leaders will do. Ask what kind of human being you are becoming in response. Do not ask only whether NESARA, lawful restoration, or structural correction will arrive. Ask whether you are ready to live in a world that requires more responsibility, more truthfulness, and less emotional dependency than the one that trained you. Do not ask only whether the regressive forces are weakening. Ask whether their habits are weakening inside you. No alliance can make that choice for you. No channel can make it for you. No prophecy can make it for you. But once you make it, the old world loses one more place to live. And that is how the greater victory comes. You were never meant to survive by becoming numb enough to tolerate your own diminishment. That is not freedom. That is not civilization. That is not the destiny of this planet. I have spoken to you of the failed turning point, of the interrupted law, of the long delay that followed, of the Earth Alliance rising inside human complexity, of the breaking of unipolar domination through multipolar movement, of the wars that served panic more than peace, of America's dangerous crossroads between disruption and ego, of the rescue operation that never ceased above the surface, and of the inner gate no one can cross for you. But none of this matters if you leave this message treating it like one more intense idea to feel for a moment and forget by tomorrow. This is not a message for momentary stimulation. It is a mirror. Look into it honestly. Why have you been so tired? Not only because your life has been hard. Not only because the world has been unstable. You have been tired because some part of you has been trying to live in truth while surrounded by structures that reward performance, dependency, fear, and fragmentation. You have been tired because your conscience keeps noticing what the culture wants you to normalize. You have been tired because your deeper being senses that humanity approached a lawful threshold, was violently delayed, and has been living in the long ache of that interruption ever since. You have been tired because you can feel the old order cracking, yet you also know that what comes next will test the soul, not just the system. That is why this hour feels sacred and heavy at the same time. You are not standing at the end of all struggle. You are standing at the point where struggle is becoming visible for what it truly has been. A contest over the human future. A contest over whether sovereignty belongs to living peoples or to concentrated predation. A contest over whether truth will remain subordinate to managed perception. A contest over whether power will continue feeding on trauma, war, debt, and fear, or whether civilization will begin reorganizing around dignity, responsibility, and conscience. A contest over whether spiritual awakening will become embodied or remain a beautiful vocabulary floating above unresolved human immaturity. This is why I did not come to soothe you with easy promises. I did not come to tell you that every rumor is revelation, that every resistance actor is righteous, or that every new alignment is automatically holy. I came to tell you something stronger. The final phase of planetary liberation is real, but it will demand more of humanity than excitement. It will demand moral adulthood. It will demand discernment. It will demand that you stop outsourcing your soul to leaders, movements, institutions, and narratives that you have not tested before truth. The Galactic Federation can guard lines, restrain certain escalations, supervise rescue corridors, and confront regressive forces in the solar system and beyond. The Earth Alliance can break machinery, expose networks, fracture monopolies, and open strategic pathways. Nations can realign. Systems can weaken. Hidden structures can fall. But if humanity does not rise inwardly, then every outer victory remains unfinished. So rise inwardly. Rise without fanaticism. Rise without hatred. Rise without giving your intelligence away. Rise without demanding perfection from history before you allow yourself to hope. Rise without turning your pain into a throne for ego. Rise in truth. That is the phrase I want to leave burning inside you, because truth is not only information. Truth is alignment. Truth is the end of inward cooperation with what degrades life. Truth is the refusal to call captivity normal. Truth is the courage to discern without becoming cruel. Truth is the strength to stand between naive worship and cynical despair and choose consciousness instead. And that consciousness is already spreading. It spreads when a human being stops confusing propaganda with reality. It spreads when a nation begins reclaiming sovereignty without worshiping domination. It spreads when people refuse to let war be the permanent religion of politics. It spreads when hidden corruption no longer receives automatic obedience. It spreads when financial and geopolitical monopolies lose their sacred aura. It spreads when the exhausted remember that their exhaustion may have been the first honest sign that their soul was no longer consenting to the lie. It spreads when people understand that the old order did not only rule through force, but through the colonization of imagination, and they decide to imagine law, dignity, restoration, and planetary responsibility again. This is why your role matters. Not because you must know every classified detail. Not because you must predict every turn. Not because you must agree with every interpretation. But because you must become the kind of human being this transition can trust. A human being who can hold complexity. A human being who can recognize manipulation without becoming manipulative. A human being who can hope without becoming gullible. A human being who can honor sovereignty without worshiping power. A human being who can feel the cosmic scale of this hour without fleeing the discipline of daily truth. If this message reached the place in you that has been tired, angry, watchful, confused, and still somehow unwilling to surrender your deepest knowing, then do not leave in silence. Let your voice become part of the field. In the comments, write this simple phrase: I rise in truth. Let that be more than a sentence. Let it be a decision. And if this transmission has helped you feel the larger pattern beneath the noise of the world, stay with this channel, not out of dependency, but out of alignment. Subscribe if you are choosing to walk this transition with deeper discernment, deeper courage, and a steadier soul. The signal is growing clearer. The interruption is ending. The buried river is rising. And history is no longer as closed as it once appeared. Arcturian signal.